I do not believe in universals. But why? Well, first of all, what do we mean when we are talking about universals? Universals are abstract entities or characteristics which are exemplified in many different objects. For example, the color red is seen as a universal, meaning that it is a kind of thing which exists abstractly and which all the things which we call red have in common. In simple terms, we would perhaps call this the redness of all red things. There are generally two schools of thought when it comes to universals. There are realists who claim that universals really exist, and then there are nominalists who believe that only particular objects exist. Of course, there are different kinds of realism and nominalism. There is Platonic realism, which says that universals exist independently in a different realm of reality. Then there is Aristotelian realism, which says that universals exist, but are only displayed within particular objects. On the other side, there is predicate nominalism, which says that universals are just names that we use. Then there is trope nominalism, which says that universals are just particular tropes of objects that are similar. And then there is conceptualism, which says that universals are just mental concepts that we use to group things in the world that are similar to each other. For me, ever since I heard about the concept of universal properties, I instantly thought that realism made no sense, and that's because it just overcomplicates everything for no good reason. Let's take a look at an example. We have two apples in front of us, and both of them seem to have the same color. Namely, they both seem red. Now, here's how a realist would have to explain this phenomenon as opposed to how a nominalist would explain this phenomenon. For the realist, there exist a bunch of abstract properties like shape, redness, etc. And these abstract properties somehow interact with the physical world, and they exemplify themselves within the two objects which happen to be in front of you. And this is why both of these apples seem to share the color red. As you can see, this explanation posits the existence of a bunch of non-empirically verifiable things, as well as the existence of some kind of relation between these things and the objects of reality. If you are a nominalist, however, the story becomes a lot simpler. The world is made out of matter, which is arranged in many different ways. Some ways of arrangement are similar to other ways of arrangement, and we group these ways of arrangement together in order to make sense of the world. So, when you see two apples and they look very similar, it's not like there is some abstract property which makes itself apparent in them, but rather you are simply looking at two arrangements of matter which have some similarities, and so you group those similarities and hold them in your mind as concepts. As you can see, the second story is a lot more parsimonious. I need not invoke any new categories of being, and yet I can explain the exact same phenomenon. This is why I believe in conceptualism. Basically, stuff happens, and sometimes the stuff that happens in one place is similar to the stuff that happens in another place. And since we are adaptive creatures, we hold the groupings of similar stuff as concepts in our heads, so that we may notice them more easily when we find them in different places. This is essentially the most basic function of our cognition, recognizing which ways of organizing the world are most useful. And perhaps this is the reason why so many people are tempted towards realism when it comes to universals. It is because the process of organizing the seemings of reality is so basic and so fundamental that it's almost impossible to fathom that the groupings between similar happenings are just mental tools and not real, distinct categories. But when we really focus on the issue, I think it becomes very clear that there is no good reason to think about abstract properties or universals when trying to describe reality. We can absolutely describe it in terms of nominalism and have no problem explaining any phenomenon. And finally, to close this video, I would like to just say that when we're trying to explain something, we should only take into account extra stuff, especially non-physical stuff, if there is some sort of reason to do so, if we have something that we cannot properly explain without it. Unless that is the case, I see no good reason why we should believe in universals or any other abstract property which explains things that can be explained a lot simpler and with no gaps in our explanatory power.